You're listening to the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.
So we're going to start very gently in the tractate of Nazir. What is a Nazir? Well, the best way of explaining what a Nazir is, that it's someone who carries these three restrictions. He doesn't cut his hair. He actually looks rather beautiful, by the way, because his hair runs long. Apparently, Avshalom, who was really King David's son, who was into himself, was a Nazir. According to the Gemara, anyway, he had these beautiful long hair. I used to cut it once a year. So there's not cutting hair. There's not consuming grapes or wine. And there's not touching the dead. Although, again, you'll notice with Samson, with Shimshon, if you're familiar with the story, you can see he's a warrior, by the way, and he absolutely touches the dead. So you can see that there are different types of Nazir, and we're going to learn about this in the Mishnah. For example, not touching dead definitely does not apply to Samson. But let's just keep these distinctions in mind, and let's have a look at the core verses, the core psukim, where these are learned out from. And these are from the Parsha of Naso in the book of Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers, actually just before the teaching of the priestly blessing. So whether there's a connection between the restrictions of Nazirut and the priestly blessing, I'm not sure, but they are contiguous in the text. And God speaks to Moshe, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe. And God speaks to Moshe and he says, Daber b'nei Yisrael v'amarta alehem ish o isha ki yafli lindur neder. Say to them, when someone shall clearly utter a vow, neder nazir, the vow of a Nazirite, lahazir lashem. So you have to utter a vow. You can already see, by the way, why the tractate of Nazir is taught right after the tractate of Nedarim, of vows. There's some connection. There's a clear connection between being a Nazir and taking a vow. It's all operationalized by taking a vow. And then the Torah goes on to explain the distinction. So he's going to abstain from wine, miyain b'shechar, yazir, chometz, yain b'chometz shechar, wine, strong drink, vinegar, anything made out of grapes, even fresh grapes, v'anavim lachim. You can't eat dried grapes, fresh grapes, nothing that's made out of the vine. And then he doesn't shave. The kol yemei neder nizro ta'ar lo ya'avor al rosho. So he doesn't shave. A razor doesn't come on his head until he's fulfilled his days. Ad melot hayamim asher yazir. Until he's fulfilled the days. And we'll see, by the way, there's a time limit for being a Nazir. So most people are not a Nazir permanently. I mean, there are famous Nazirim who are permanently Nazirim, but your average Nazir is Nazir for a period. So he doesn't shave for a period. And then finally, he can't go near to a dead body, not even if it's his father or his mother or his brother or his sister. And if some dead guy should suddenly die next to him, it's almost a pun in Hebrew. V'chiyamut mate alav. If a dead man should die just next door to him, b'feta pitom, suddenly. So in other words, he can't avoid getting in contact with this dead person. Then he's going to shave his head on the seventh day, and then he brings this sacrifice of two turtles. So those are the essential halakhot from the Torah about Nazirut. And the Mishnah begins, Kol kinyei Nazirut ki Nazirut. All nicknames for Nazirut are like Nazirut. And you'll say, oh yeah, we've seen this before, haven't we? And sure enough, it's there in the Mishnah of Nedarim. Let's go back and look at the first Mishnah in Nedarim. First Mishnah in Nedarim, Kol Kol kinyei nadarim ki nadarim. All nicknames for vows are like vows. So Nazarim begins, all nicknames for vows are like vows, and Nazir begins, all nicknames for Nazirut are like Nazirut. So, and the way that Maimonides explains it in the Mishneh Torah is that we don't need accurate language when we make a vow of Nazirut. But as soon as someone has taken it upon him in his head, that's the way that the Rambam explains it. As soon as he decides he's going to be a Nazir, then he says something quite general, and that makes him a Nazir. So we're not precise in our language. And the Mishnah is going to give some examples. Ha'omer ehet, someone who says, I shall be. Harei ze Nazir. He only has to say, I shall be. The Gemara thinks, by the way, that there's a Nazir walking along the road opposite him. Maybe that's what's going on, but he's very vague about it. Or he says, Ehei na'eh le Nazir. I shall be pretty for a Nazir. Or he says, Nazir. That's a sort of not quite, we saw in the Nazarim actually that there are different sort of corruptions of the word korban. And there seem to be corruptions of the word Nazir, because he can say Nazir or Nasiach or Paziach, and it all works. Harei ze Nazir. All of these abbreviations or nicknames seem to work. He can say Hareini vazeh. Here I shall be like that one. Or Hareini msalsal. Behold, I shall curl. It's talking about curling his hair, right? Hareini msalsal, I'm going to curl. Or Hareini mchalkel. Maybe I'm going to tend. He talks about kilkul with a chaf. This is not with a kuf. It's with a chaf is to essentially to take care of something. He's taking care of his hair. Hareini mechalkel. I shall tend. That is to say, I'll tend my hair. Harei alei l'shalach pera, which I'll grow my hair long. There's an expression like that in Yechezkel. All of these general words, Harei ze Nazir. He's a Nazir. What if he says, Harei alai tzipurim? Behold, I got an obligation to bring birds. Remember, we learned that if he's a Nazir and suddenly he, without kind of being able to avoid it, he comes into contact with a dead body, he has to bring 2 turtle doves as a sacrifice. These are the birds we're talking about. So he says, Harei alei tzipurim. I'm taking on an obligation to bring birds. Rabbi Meir Omer Nazir. Rabbi Meir says he's a Nazir. The sages say he's not a Nazir. By the way, he still has to bring the birds, because it seemed from the sages, although he's just consecrated birds or made a promise to bring birds to the temple, but he's not a Nazir. And that's the first Mishnah in Nazir. We're going to conclude there, but tomorrow we will look at the story of Samson, of Shimshon, and we'll learn more about different types of Nazir from the story of Samson.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.